political developments over history in different countries. So for example, in the United Kingdom, which is a very small area with a lot of machines and a lot of people, some political scientists have claimed that in the late 18th century, early 19th century, labor was an abundant factor, capital was an abundant factor, and land was a very scarce factor. On the other hand, in Germany, the thought ran that labor was an abundant factor. There were lots of people in Germany. Land was scarce and capital was scarce because they weren't nearly as industrially developed as England was. And as a result, in England, you saw an alliance forming between capital and labor. And out of that, you got the political spectrum where there were the conservatives who represented the landed interests and the Liberal Party, which was sort of like pro-progress and so forth, which represented the interests of capital and labor. On the other hand, in Germany, because there was an alliance between capital and land, you saw this very reactionary alliance forming that led to World War I and maybe eventually to World War II. So that's sort of an interesting way you can think about politics in terms of the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. Now, classic comparative advantage is based on these sort of natural endowments that countries have. So, and I think this can explain a number of things that we observe in trade. So, for example, there's a big trade between China and Latin America or Africa right now, where China sends produced manufactured goods, and those countries send raw materials, right? Similarly, there's a big trade between the United States and Latin America, where Latin America produces lots of bananas and sugar and warm climate produce, and the US produces things like wheat and corn that grow better in the climate of the United States. But there are many sources of trade that aren't captured by either of these basic things we've talked about so far. So one of these that I think is most important is endogenous specialization, which was something that was modeled by Paul Krugman, and this was based on Adam Smith's model of the pin factory. So in the world right now, most hardware for computers is produced in Japan or in China, and most software comes from the United States. Why is that? I mean, it's not really clear that there's any particular reason why Japan is better suited to producing hardware and the US is better suited to producing software. I think it's more that they've just developed whole industries that do that, and there's a lot of feedback gains from developing such an industry, right? So everyone can gain from different regions focusing, and there can be lots of reasons why focusing matters, either because a factory is increasing returns to scale, because there's learning by doing, as we talked about in the manufacturing of aircrafts, or just because cities create sort of spillovers where there's areas where people are all talking to each other about producing something. So another example of this, there was an NPR story a few days ago that you guys can look up about mushrooms. So almost something like 70% of all mushrooms in the United States are produced in a small region of southwestern Pennsylvania. And there just ain't no good reason why you should produce mushrooms there. There's nothing particularly productive about mushrooms there. They've just been producing mushrooms there for a very long time. So they know a lot about producing mushrooms. And so it's specialized there. Another example of this is Smith's case of the pin factory. I don't know if anyone's read The Wealth of Nations. But he's got all these workers. There's nothing particularly different about these different workers. But each one of them can be much more productive if they focus on doing just one narrow task, because they get better at it over time, and they don't have to constantly be switching between different activities. Another version of this, which is called the Mellotts Model, sort of comes out of what we talked about on Tuesday. So when countries trade, the most talented people in any given country can reach a very big audience. And rather than just having sort of the crappy local asparagus, we can get the best asparagus in the world. And this is a bit like comparative advantage, but the key driver is natural differences in ability of people within a given industry rather than a focus across different industries in producing different things. You get access to the best people in an area. And there's lots of other sort of versions of gains from trade, but they all come from logic that's sort of similar to this, which has to do with taking advantage of differences that exist, either differences in how much I have relative to how much I want, or how good I am at making something relative to how good you are at making it. All trade comes from taking advantage of heterogeneity of one sort or another. OK. So now I want to talk about the comparatives. Yeah, David.
I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
The comparative advantage, you used examples mainly that were like nation to nation.
Yeah.
How would that work more in depth in terms of like firm to firm, especially in like a simple maybe like why would there be any reason for a firm to like not be in the same industry even though it's in like the same general region?
Yeah. So in terms of comparative advantage, I mean, all these principles apply going all the way down to the level of individual people or all the way up to the level of countries or the world. So, you know, some of you are probably better at math, and other of you are better at, you know, writing. You probably could do better on the problem sets, though I wouldn't encourage this, if one of you just wrote all the writing, right, and the other person did all the math, right? So that's a very, you know, low-level example of comparative advantage. But I believe that there's learning by doing and economies of scale, and so you shouldn't do that. You should instead be protectionist, because that will help you build up the capacity to be good at those things in the future, right? Does that answer your question,
so
David?
In that sense, why is it maybe not in a country's best interest to do just that?
To be protectionist.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that the Krugman model helps you see why, in some sense, protectionism sort of obviously can be good. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, anytime you're trying to learn to do something, like bake, you know, you might not be as good of a baker as, you know, some bakery that you can go buy something at. But if you want to learn to bake, you start being a protectionist. You stop buying your baked goods at the place that's better at making them, and you start subjecting your family to eating your cookies until you get good at it, right? Because you don't have any, you know, you need to have a market for what you're doing in order to get better. And you know, on the other hand, there's lots of things you do buy in the market. So I don't think you should look at the trade across countries as being any different from the decisions we made about trading across people. Most of the time we buy stuff from the market from the people that are most comparatively advantaged. But when there's something that we know that we could be in the long run really good at doing, but we haven't developed an industry in that area yet, then it makes a lot of sense to be protectionist and develop our abilities in that area. Yeah, Charlie.
It made me think of a recent example where Obama did not allow the Chinese energy companies to invest in these windmills in the West Coast.
Yeah. Well, but the trade-off is that you really should only do that in areas where you have a good reason to think that in the long term, you're the best person to be producing that, right? So advantage of trade, as Mellotts points out, is it allows us to focus on our absolute best areas, even if we need some time to develop those areas, right? And so that's constantly the tension in these things. How well can you project what you'll be best at? The competitive pressures are needed to keep you performing at the top level, but on the other hand, you need to relax those in order to develop your capacities. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
I mean, in policy making, though, there's a lot more that goes, like, you know, the Chinese workers who get paid like their minimum wage would probably be better at making cars.
Yep.
But you can't send all the jobs over there because, you know, that wouldn't really do so well in towns that have factories. So
Well, that's the Stolper-Samuelson theorem that we were just talking about, right? So that causes distributive but not efficiency problems. And the question is there a reasonable way to, you know, I think the problem with that sort of an argument is like lots of technology has done much, much more to put people out of work than trade does, right? Like, you know, when there are, when someone invents the light bulb, all the candlestick makers lose their job, right? So, okay. So now I want to talk about comparative statics of equilibrium. So imagine we put a subsidy in, or that supply rises for some reason. Is Ryan here? Ryan? What would we expect to happen to prices when that occurs?
If there's a subsidy that's given,
Or we increase the supply of a good.
we increase the supply, the prices should fall down.
Yeah.
Given less negative supply.
Yeah, exactly. So you'd expect quantity to rise, consumer prices to fall. This follows from the normal shape of supply and demand curves. But I want to try to be a little bit more precise about that here so we see exactly what it is that's driving it. So imagine that we have the normal supply and demand equation, but we can add something to supply, S, right? So Chengyi, can you derive for me what the change in price is when this supply shifter increases from the implicit function theorem? Here's the equation. You can do it on the board if you want.
But should we need a sheet for the formula for supply or demand?
Well, this is the supply curve, S of P, and D of P is the demand curve. So they're just an abstract function here. So we want to use the implicit function theorem, right? Take the derivative of both sides with respect to S.
Yeah, but I'm not sure what would be the derivative of supply or demand with respect to S.
Well, it's going to be S prime times dP ds, right? That's the implicit function theorem, right? So we get 1 plus S prime times dP ds is equal to D prime times dP ds. And then we can collect the two dP ds terms on this side and then divide through by them, and we get 1 over D prime minus S prime. Right? OK. Now, this is the classic elasticity formula that you guys probably learned for the incidence of attacks or of any shift. This has to be negative because demand is downward sloping and supply is upward sloping, right? But something to notice is you don't need that. So actually, both demand and supply could be downward sloping or both could be upward sloping. All you need is that demand is sloping downward in price relative to supply. Right? So let me show you a picture of that. I've reversed the axes here. Here's quantity and here's price. Imagine demand is sloping downward relative to supply. That is, both supply and demand here are downward sloping, but demand slopes down more quickly, right? Then an increase in supply is going to lead to a reduction in the price. On the other hand, if demand is sloping, if supply actually cuts demand from above to below, if it's sloping down relative to demand, then an increase in supply will actually increase price. Now that sounds really weird, but what's going on? Yeah, Joe.
I just had a question. Is there an example of when supply would ever be downward sloping?
No, but I mean, we could do this with demand, and then you could talk about a Giffen good.
Okay.
And that would be fine. I mean, so if both of them were upward sloping, again, it would be that demand has to cut supply from below to above. So if demand were like that and supply were like that, we would still be fine. Okay, so why, other than the normal demand theory reasons, does it not make any sense for us to be in this picture? Well, imagine we were here, right? And we started at this equilibrium. And then for some reason, someone just announced the wrong price.